Between 1096 and 1270, there were 8 papally approved crusades. Muslims in jihad had conquered much of the Byzantine Empire, so that the only parts left under Byzantine control were Italy, Greece, and Turkey. The Muslims took from the Byzantine Empire the Middle East, including Jerusalem, North Africa, and Spain. As a result, people in Europe felt it necessary to wage their own version of a jihad called Crusade against the Muslims, beginning in 1096 and ending in 1270. As I mentioned just a moment ago, there were 8 crusades between 1096 and 1270, and what I'd like to share with you before I actually start my discussion of the first crusade is a little bit of chronology about the crusades and just somewhat of a brief overview of a couple of them. So here we go, chronology of the crusades. First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. Jerusalem falls to the Crusaders of Europe in 1099, thus ending the First Crusade. Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149. Jerusalem taken by the Muslims, 1187. Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. Richard the Lionhearted takes Jaffa, but Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands. Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204. Crusaders sack or take over Constantinople. Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221. Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229. Jerusalem returns to Christian control for 15 years, from 1229 to 1244. Seventh Crusade, 1248 to 1250. Eighth Crusade, 1269 to 1270. Muslims seize and destroy last Christian outposts in the Holy Land. Pope Urban II, whose reign as Pope was from 1088 to 1099. In France, on November 27, 1095, at a place called Clermont, Pope Urban delivered a speech which was designed to get Christians interested in the idea of a crusade. Pope Urban II hoped to persuade Christians from all over Europe to join a special kind of pilgrimage, a holy war against the Muslims, who had taken over Jerusalem as they had swept through the Near East or Middle East, spreading their new religion of Islam. What Pope Urban said was, quote, "The frenzy of the barbarians has devastated the churches of God in the East, and has even, shame to say, seized into slavery the holy city of Christ, Jerusalem." With the final words, "God wills it," Pope Urban II had worked the crowd into a frenzy and inspired them to literally take up the cross, march through the Middle East, and defeat the Muslims and attempt to take the holy city of Jerusalem. And the people at this meeting, as well as people all around Europe, responded, because in the Middle Ages, no lay person or regular person could rise to a greater calling than to join the Crusades against the Muslim infidel. And literally taking up the sign of the cross, thousands of God-fearing, God-loving men and women risked their own lives to reclaim the Holy Land from the Muslim infidels. These crusaders were led by fanatics, sometimes armed with nothing more than their faith or belief in God, and by nobles and knights with lances and swords. They became, as one historian described, a horde outnumbering the sand of the seashore or the stars of heaven. And not only did these pilgrims travel far from their homes and families, but most of them had put all of their money, all of their family fortune into the journey, thinking that they would more or less earn forgiveness of all their sins and gain an assured place in heaven by participating in these crusades. Many of them who who were lucky enough to survive would actually return home, of course, broke, completely economically devastated from their participation in the Crusades. Of all of the purposes behind the Crusades, number one, always and foremost of every single crusade, is to retake the Holy Land from the Muslims. A crusade would be called because the Holy Land of Jerusalem had fallen to the Muslims. The crusade would not end until Jerusalem was in the hand of Christian crusaders. Of course, when the crusade would end with Christian recapture of Jerusalem, the Muslims would begin to fight to take it back. They would gain the city of Jerusalem, hence the need for another crusade. A second reason or purpose behind each of these crusades was rapprochement, or to heal the 1054 schism among Christians in Europe. The Byzantine Empire and Western Europe had been going their separate ways since 476 AD. In 1054, the Byzantines just took this one step further and said that they were no longer Roman Catholic. They were now Greek Orthodox, and rather than looking to the Pope in Rome as their head, they looked to a father of the church in Constantinople as the head of their church, now called the Greek Orthodox Church. So the popes of Europe, of the Roman Catholic Church, had hoped that they could bring the Greek Orthodox people together with Roman Catholics and fight against a common enemy, and in the course of defeating and fighting the Muslims, all Christians would come back together again, and there would be only one church. This, of course, would benefit the Pope because it would give him more people that he's in charge of. Number 3, these popes hoped to get rid of heretics, anyone living in Europe who did not accept the total teachings of the Catholic Church, anyone who veered just slightly from accepting the total beliefs of the Catholic Church was labeled a heretic, and Christians were given the permission to attack these heretics, these people who didn't quite fit in, and kill them with the blessing of the Church. Also, as I mentioned just a moment ago, this was a very expensive undertaking to participate in a crusade. Many of the average individuals and even some of the professional fighters of the time, the knights, didn't have enough money to pay for the equipment and supplies for a magnitude of this undertaking, so they borrowed money from Jews who charged them interest on the money that was borrowed. So as they were heading towards the Middle East to attack Muslims, they also attacked Jews, killed them as the murderers and betrayers of Christ, but also attacked them because many of these Christians resented owing money to the Jews. Another purpose of the Crusades is to get rid of troublemaking knights. Knights were sworn in the Middle Ages to fight. That's their job for all of society. They were described as those who fight. So they would be sent about by the various kings of Europe to wage war on behalf of their king against another king or any of the enemies of the man for whom they were pledged to work. And when they didn't have some war to participate in, knights could be very dangerous, getting into a lot of trouble, stirring up trouble in villages. So the Pope saw an opportunity to get rid of troublemaking knights, to give them an actual purpose in life, which was to fight against the Muslims. Opportunities also were granted for average Christians who went on crusade, the opportunity to gain land and wealth in the Middle East, as well as to have adventure and excitement in a life that usually meant a person didn't travel any more than 25 miles from their birthplace, and also the forgiveness of sin. It was guaranteed by the popes who called for each of these crusades that a person who participated in the crusade was given an indulgence of forgiveness of sin. As the crusades progress, indulgence becomes forgiveness of past and future sins and can be obtained not by physical participation in the crusades, but also by paying money to the Catholic Church to finance other people who were going on crusade. And by the end of the 8th and final crusade, indulgence had come to represent forgiveness of past and future sins for living Christians who gave money to the crusading efforts of others, and it also was available to those people who paid, that they could ask for a dead relative to be forgiven and released from hell. the increasing definition of the indulgences through the Crusades show that the Crusades and the Roman Catholic Church become more and more desperate for support and participation. The Crusades overall are a complete and total failure. We have a tendency sometimes to romanticize knights, as well as this crusading fever that swept across Europe from 1096 to 1270, but that's really an idea based on ignorance and lack of information. The purposes of the Crusades were only met in the First Crusade. The rest of them were completely and totally inept adventures. Basically, they were poorly funded, poorly organized, poorly done. Okay, what we're going to look at here for a moment is the First Crusade. And I would like to start by pointing out here that the First Crusade was from 1096 AD to 1099 AD. In this crusade, the Christians head off, as they would many other times, without a lot of thought as to what's going to happen when they get to Jerusalem. When these crusaders arrive in Jerusalem, they are trying to protect themselves from Muslim arrows. These mounted knights from Christian Europe had on iron helmets and shirts and leggings made out of chainmail. And while this armor did protect them, it weighed them down considerably. Wearing this kind of armor could add as much as 100 pounds to a man, and it gave them a disadvantage because they couldn't move as quickly as the Muslims could, who were lightly clad in armor and had faster horses, and that gave the Muslims actually an advantage in cavalry battles. When the earliest Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem for the first time, it was June 7th. And basically what they found here was that the city was absolutely beautiful, breathtakingly gorgeous. It was a city that they had read about in the Bible, heard talked about in church, and for many of them it was a moving experience to actually see the city of Jerusalem in person. But they quickly realized they were going to have problems taking over this city from the Muslims because the city was one of the most heavily fortified at the time. It was surrounded by massive stone walls, and they didn't know what to do. Now, add to this, they don't have enough food. Also, they find that there are no local wells anymore. The Muslims were smart enough to fill in many of the wells or to poison them so that these Christians would have no water. So it's a very, very difficult situation for those first Crusaders who showed up, but miraculously, they see on the horizon boats coming, reinforcements, and when these reinforcements show up, they've brought with them from Italy and England carpenters and all sorts of wood that they use to build ladders, and also mobile walls and siege towers. So with this added capability, the Christian Crusaders are able to attack the city, to scale the walls and take the city. And once they got inside the holy city of Jerusalem, the Crusaders took their swords and slashed at anybody they came into contact with, including civilians who were fleeing from them and begging for their lives. And one eyewitness said that the Crusaders killed and dismembered them, showing no mercy even to women and children. The leaders of this particular attack wrote to the Pope, quote, "If you want to know what was done to the enemy, the Muslim, we found in the city, know this, that in many areas our men rode in the blood of the Muslims up to the knees of their horses." So Jerusalem fell to the Christians, and the dead were really so numerous that their bodies formed these huge funeral pyres that some eyewitnesses said were as big as houses. It was estimated before this first crusade that as many as 20,000 Muslims and Jews had lived in the city, and now very few remained. So at the end of the First Crusade, the Christians from Europe could claim control over much territory in the Middle East, including the city of Jerusalem, some surrounding areas like Tripoli, Edessa, Antioch, Damascus, and Acre. These areas became what were called as Crusader or feudal kingdoms. These areas were all taken in the First Crusade, but none were held long term. Shortly after the Eighth Crusade, every one of these areas had fallen to the Muslims yet again. So all of these areas would be lost by 1291. So at the end of the First Crusade, Christians could claim the Holy Land as theirs. Of course, in between the First Crusade and the Third Crusade, which is the next one we're going to, it goes without saying sort of that there was a Second Crusade. Why did we need a Second Crusade? Because after the First Crusade, Jerusalem changed hands again. Christians had to go in, they thought, wrestle away the city once again. They hold on to it at the end of the Second Crusade, lose it again. So, as needed, a Third Crusade. The Third Crusade was from 1189 to 1192. The Third Crusade is significant because it includes some of the most famous leaders, political and religious leaders, from the period of the 12th century. Just to give you a little background, the city of Jerusalem fell in 1187 again to the Muslims, this time under the leadership of a Muslim sultan or caliph called Salah al-Din, or just normally in the Western world called Saladin. Saladin told Christian Europe, sent messages to Christian Europe that Christians could be freed to come to Jerusalem, that they would enjoy Saladin's protection, that they need not fear that they would be attacked by Muslims. Many Christians in Europe wanted to go on pilgrimages to Jerusalem to visit the holy city, and they felt they could not do that as long as it was under Muslim control. Well, Saladin points out to Europe, you don't have to worry about that anymore. I'm a nice, open-minded kind of guy, so if Christians want to venture over here to Jerusalem, they'll enjoy my protection. Well, that's not good enough for Christians. Christians feel like the holy city of Jerusalem cannot be under Muslim control, even if the Muslim who's controlling Jerusalem is a nice guy like Saladin, it's not allowable. So, from the Holy Roman Empire, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Barbarossa meaning red beard, Frederick Barbarossa was the Holy Roman Emperor from 1152 until 1190. He leads a group of German and Italian knights into the Holy Land. He is joined by the King of France, Philip Augustus, who reigned from 1180 until his death in 1223. From England, the English knights are led by Henry II's son, Richard the Lion-Hearted, who reigned from 1189 to 1199 as the King of England. And what is interesting to point out about Richard the Lion-Hearted is that his reign, 1189 to 1199, is 10 years long, but he's only physically in England for just 6 months out of that 10 years. So where is he? Well, he's on crusade from 1189 until 1192. But still, you see, that leaves 7 years. So where was he during those 7 years? Well, on his way back from the Third Crusade, Richard the Lion-Hearted gets held for ransom and basically spends his remaining years held captive inside the Holy Roman Empire, and it's up to his brother, John the First, to try to gain money to pay Richard's ransom to get his brother's freedom. And you kind of have to feel sorry for John the First here. His reign officially begins in 1199 and ends in 1216, but in actuality, John was ruling while Richard was off on crusade. So John was unofficially leading England since 1189. And because John was so desperate to get money to free his brother who was ransomed on the way back from the crusade, John issues really extremely high taxes on the English people, especially on widows. He forced widows to pay a tax to avoid being married again, and when men went off on crusade from England, they entrusted John to look out for their marriageable daughters. And what John did actually with these daughters of men who went on crusades was that he sold them at auction more or less to the highest bidder, rather than actually thinking about who would be a good match for these young women. So John more or less got off to a bad start in England, and the people didn't think very highly of him. And actually his high taxes led to this popular hero's emergence, a guy named Robin Hood, who stole from the rich and gave to the poor so that they could pay their taxes to John I. Eventually, the English people had had enough of John, and they forced him in 1215 to sign what was called the Magna Carta, which is Latin for Great Charter or Great Piece of Paper, and they forced him to sign this agreement which would limit his power forever. So John, just keep in mind, is ruling England in the absence of his brother Richard the Lionhearted. So in 1189, these three guys, Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip Augustus, the King of France, and Richard the Lionhearted, the King of England, head off to the Middle East to fight against Saladin for control of Jerusalem. Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionhearted had a sort of strange relationship, and historians have tried to figure this out for generations, and nobody's really come up with an acceptable I guess you could say an acceptable explanation for what was going on with those two. But Richard is always described and always thought of as being this really hardcore warrior type, but he actually had a soft side. He wrote poetry, and the poetry was dedicated to young men. And well, just to sum it up pretty quickly, Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionhearted appeared to be slightly more than friends, and they shared a tent on many occasions, but were also given to arguing quite bitterly and feverishly. And Frederick Barbarossa was the peacemaker between these two guys, Philip Augustus and Richard. Whenever Philip and Richard would start arguing with each other, Frederick Barbarossa would step in and say, okay, look guys, got to concentrate on the enemy here, which is Saladin. You got to put aside your differences, whatever they might be, and let's work on a common enemy together. Unfortunately, for the Third Crusade, Frederick Barbarossa died in a freak accident on crusade, and it makes no sense whatsoever, but Frederick Barbarossa decided to go for a swim wearing his armor, which weighed about 100 pounds. So he drowned in a river on the way to the Third Crusade. That left Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionhearted, who bickered over everything, including an attack plan for Jerusalem. So, long crusade made very short. Richard and Philip Augustus claimed that in 1192 they had won the Third Crusade, that they had captured Jerusalem and they had forced Saladin to sign a treaty, and more or less what the treaty said, I think you'll find somewhat interesting and slightly amusing. The treaty said, Saladin agreed to this and signed it, that Christians could make pilgrimages to Jerusalem without fear of being attacked or mistreated by Muslims. So most historians agree that the Third Crusade really didn't accomplish anything. All it did was to take Saladin's statement that he had made before the Third Crusade started and got it more or less put onto paper, but they could have saved tens of thousands of lives if they had skipped the Third Crusade altogether. So the Third Crusade, I guess you could kind of classify as a draw, somewhere in between victory and defeat. The city of Jerusalem really remained under Saladin's control, but Richard and Frederick Barbarossa and Philip Augustus had gone there to free it from Saladin. Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionhearted did not achieve this. It was still under the rule of Saladin, but they claimed that because of the treaty they had gotten, that Jerusalem had been quote-unquote captured. So on the way back from this third crusade, Richard is ransomed. We already discussed that. I want to tell you lastly that the third crusade, and this is just crazy, inspired what was called the Children's Crusades in Europe right along the same time as the third crusade was underway. People in Europe allowed their children less than 10 years old in most cases, to head out for the Holy Land to fight alongside knights and other Christians to gain control of Jerusalem. And what is sad is that the majority of them never even made it to the Holy Land. They got lost or died from starvation, exposure to the elements. Those that did make it to the Holy Land were actually captured by the Muslims and sold into slavery and child prostitution. The next and last crusade that we're going to talk about is the Fourth Crusade from 1202 to 1204. The person responsible for calling the Fourth Crusade is Pope Innocent III, who reigned as Pope from 1198 to 1216. His reign as the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church is considered to be the high point of papal power. What do we mean by that? It's not just that he called for a crusade. Let's face it, there are 8 different crusades that are called, so calling for a crusade is not what makes Pope Innocent so powerful. It's other things he does besides that, just to give you a couple of examples. Philip Augustus, the King of France during the Third Crusade, had attempted to divorce his wife. He said he had divorced her, that he had left her, that she was no longer his wife. And his reasoning for that, I guess, you can just think about that. It seemed maybe possibly he was interested in Richard, but whatever. Philip Augustus had tried to divorce his wife, but Pope Innocent III reminded him that for a Catholic there was no such thing as divorce, that it was death or marriage. There was no in between. You were married until, quote, death do you part. So Philip Augustus was forced by Innocent III to take back a wife that he did not want and that he had divorced. Well, with Frederick Barbarossa's death, there was a need for a new Holy Roman Emperor. Pope Innocent III chose the next Holy Roman Emperor, a man named Frederick II. I would point out to you that at this point, if Pope Innocent III had seen that any king around Europe was attempting to appoint someone to a church office, he would have been very upset and called this lay investiture and tried to prevent it from happening. Yet here's the Pope appointing a person to a political office. He also forced unpopular King John of England to accept a man that John did not want in the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. And we talked about how since 1122, kings were not allowed to appoint people to church offices, but they could veto nominees suggested by the Pope. So John and Innocent III basically bickered back and forth over who the next Archbishop of Canterbury should be. Becket had been killed by King John's daddy, Henry II, so Innocent III and John are arguing back and forth who would be the best candidate, and that set up a power struggle between the two, and eventually John got tired of vetoing and gave in to Pope Innocent III's appointment. Pope Innocent III also called for the Fourth Crusade from 1202 to 1204. This crusade I'm just sharing with you because it sort of epitomizes what the remainder of the Crusades will be like. Complete and total mess-ups from the get-go. What Pope Innocent III told Christians across Europe is that they should participate in this crusade because it was the right thing to do to take up holy war against the Muslims. He promised them an indulgence or forgiveness of sin for participating. And he told them to meet in the Italian city of Venice, and from Venice they would go across Europe and down into the Byzantine Empire and down to Jerusalem. So what he negotiated with the Venetians, the people who live in Venice, was that the Venetians would stockpile all of the equipment and all the supplies needed by the Crusaders, so that when the Crusaders showed up in Venice, they would pay for the equipment that was already assembled there, pick up their share, and head off towards the Middle East to Jerusalem to battle the Muslims there. Well, the Venetians did their part. They stockpiled all of this weaponry and armament and chain mail, food, everything that a crusader would need. And what the Venetians were told was that they should expect about 30,000 crusaders to show up. So the Venetians stockpiled, paid for this themselves, enough equipment for 30,000 crusaders. Well, in 1202, only about 15,000 crusaders showed up in Venice. And as a result here, the Venetians are going to be stuck with a lot of extra equipment that they don't need, and they certainly want to be paid for it. So while these crusaders were hanging around in Venice waiting to decide, waiting to hear what the Venetians decide about the situation, the Venetians and the Crusaders come up with a compromise. The Venetians say, okay, if we're going to be stuck with all this extra equipment, and you can't afford to pay us for all the extra equipment, you Crusaders, we want you to attack a city for us. That city is Zara, which today would be in the modern-day country of Hungary in Eastern Europe, and it's a Christian city. And the reason the Venetians wanted this city of Zara is that the Venetians were major traders at this time. They dominated commerce on the Mediterranean Sea, and they had built lots of boats using high-quality wood that they got in the forests around Zara. But the people of Zara thought a lot of their high-quality wood and charged exorbitant prices for it. So the Venetians asked these crusaders, will you attack Zara and give us control of that city so we can have free wood for our ships? If yes, we'll just absorb all the costs of this extra equipment. So the Crusaders agreed to do this. They marched to Zara in Hungary, attack that city, destroy it, and give it to the Venetians. Then they finally get on the road towards Constantinople in order to head south from Constantinople down into Jerusalem. When the Christian Crusaders get to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, they find that city in a state of civil war. There were two emperors warring with each other for control of Constantinople. One of them had been deposed. His name was Alexis. Alexis asked the Crusaders if they would help him fight against his enemy and give him back control of Constantinople, that he would pay them very well if they were willing to do this. So the Crusaders attack Christians of the Greek Orthodox faith in Constantinople, kill them, devastate churches there, and actually strip out the artwork in many of these Greek Orthodox churches, and they take it back to Rome. And long story short, in the Fourth Crusade, the Christians of Europe attacked two Christian cities, Zara and Constantinople. They never even make it to Jerusalem to battle the Muslims, and it's as a result of the Fourth Crusade that the schism between Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox people remains permanent. People in the Byzantine Empire refused to join up with the Roman Catholic Church to come together as one whole church because the Roman Catholics had attacked them in Constantinople. So the Fifth through Eighth Crusades are just as pathetic as the Fourth Crusade. As we said before, the importance of the Crusades are its causes and its overall results. Those overall results include permanent schism between Greek Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, bitterness between Christians and Muslims, which exists still to this day. Commerce developed between the Middle East and Europe, and there were opportunities for women to participate in the Crusades, and there were opportunities for the women who stayed behind in Europe. Women who stayed behind in Europe and did not travel to the Middle East to physically participate in a crusade often chose to open their homes as inns to knights, that is, professional soldiers, and average Christians who had taken up the cross and were heading to the Middle East to do battle with the Muslims for the city of Jerusalem. So women who stayed behind in Europe offered their homes as resting places, as inns, for Christian crusaders. This gave them a source of income, an added source of wealth, while their husbands were away on crusade. Some of these women also offered themselves as companions to knights and to Christian crusaders. I don't know if we would consider this really an opportunity, quote unquote, but some historians say that one of the opportunities created for these women left behind in Europe was that they not only opened their homes to crusaders, but they also offered themselves as prostitutes for crusading armies. This, of course, gave them an added source of money and revenue. Many women who stayed behind enjoyed the freedom of being without their husbands, sons, and fathers. For the first time in their lives, these women were managing the manor or their home. In the Middle Ages, the home or castle, we would say, of a noble or knight was referred to as a manor. So when the husband was away and his friends were away and most of the men in a community were away on crusade, it was often left to the woman to oversee the management of the manor while her husband was away. So many women enjoyed this sort of liberation of being in control of the household, of overseeing the serfs and slaves, of having a bit of social freedom, of being able to step outside of their normal role, which was confined to just being a wife and mother, to branch out, to manage and oversee farmlands, etc., to oversee the account books of the manor. Some women were reluctant to give this newfound freedom up when their husbands returned. Many hoped that their husbands would not return so that they could continue in this position of manager of the household. And some of you may be thinking now, a wife would never feel that way. It is important to point out right here that in the Middle Ages, marriages were arranged marriages among noble class people. So a woman was typically married by the time she was 16, promised at a much younger age than that actually. Usually her husband was chosen for her by her father somewhere around the age of 12 or 13. And if a woman was not married by the time she was 20 years old in the Middle Ages, she was considered to be an old maid, a has-been. So women in this period often found that some of them developed feelings of love and affection for their husbands, while others did not. The arrangement or the matchmaking on the behalf of the parents and the husband-to-be simply did not work. Also consider that husbands usually did not marry in this period until they were in their 30s, sometimes as late as 40. So with that huge age difference of 16 or slightly younger to a 40-year-old man, I think you all probably understand that huge age difference meant oftentimes that a young girl recently married felt that her husband was more of a father figure to her, and it was difficult for some of these young girls to develop feelings of romantic love for their husbands. And with the closeness in age between a mother and a child, you think oftentimes a mother in this period was closer in age to the children that she would have than in age to her husband. It often meant that wives were closer to their children than to their husbands. They regarded their husbands as father figures, or sometimes the age difference could be so extreme that they regarded them more as like old men, as grandfatherly types. And while they may have obviously performed their wifely duties, it was not something that they relished or really enjoyed. So some of them were quite excited when their husbands decided to take up the cross and go on crusade, and these young brides encouraged their husbands, yes, please go, and maybe hopefully you won't come back. So these are just a few of the results of the Crusades. Schism in the Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches made permanent. Bitterness between Christians in Europe over the idea of the crusade, which still exists to this day. Commerce or trade increased between the Middle East and Europe, and so-called opportunities for women who stayed behind.